Good evening, everyone. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you to an evening with Grant Hill, and he's going to discuss his book, Game. Before we do that, I'd like to thank Duke Black Alumni and Duke Alumni Engagement for hosting this event. Again, my name is Kareem Cook. I'm class of 94, and I'm really privileged and honored to be here. Funny enough, every time I tell people that I went to Duke University, I like to ask, did you play basketball? And I always say, no, there was a guy by the name of Grant Hill playing my position when I got there, and the coaching staff and Coach K just didn't see it the same way I saw it. Grant Hill is one of my best friends, and he will be being interviewed by distinguished professor Mark Anthony Neal. Mark Anthony Neal is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African American Studies and chair of the Department of African American Studies at Duke University, where he offers courses on Black masculinity, popular culture, digital humanities. He is also an author of several books, including What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Public Culture, Soul Baby, Post-Soul Aesthetics, and Looking for Leroy. He is also a host of a video podcast, Left of Black, and can be found on Twitter at New Black Man and on Instagram at Booker BB Brown. He will be interviewing my very close dear friend, Grant Hill. And I just wanted to say that Grant is one of the most amazing, just complex, and just intelligent people that I've ever met. Many people know him as an all-star and superstar basketball player, but Grant is much, much more than that. Some of the things that he's done or continues to do, and I'll read off some of them. He's currently on the board of directors of Campbell. He's founded and been on the board of a mezzanine group called Penta Mezzanine. He's a founder of Hill Ventures, doing real estate deals. He's a member of the board of governors of the NCAA, a board of directors and secretary to the NBA Retired Players Association. He's on the board of directors of Empire State Realty. He's on the board of directors of the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. He's been an Olympic gold medalist. He's also been to the national championship with Duke University and won 2 national championships with Duke. But I think his greatest accomplishment, he'll tell you, is being a loving husband and a father of 2 beautiful daughters and an amazing son. Grant is just really one of the most amazing people walking this planet. And forgot to mention, least of all, he's also an investor and on the board of a small company called Nature. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope you enjoyed learning more about my friend Grant Hill, and you go out and buy his book, Game. Thank you.
Hey, Grant, how are you doing this evening?
Hello, Mark. I'm doing well. Thank you, Kareem, for the very kind words in your introduction.
So everyone knows about Grant Hill, the basketball player, the 2-time champion, NCAA champion. And of course, Kareem just shared all the stuff that you've been doing since you retired from professional basketball. Let me start with this question. When did you find time to write a book? And when did you know that you really wanted to tell your story the way that you do in Game?
Great question. I think for me, the idea of writing a book really all started in 2018 when I had the good fortune of being inducted or enshrined into the Basketball Hall of Fame. And I think that's a moment in time where you naturally will reflect and naturally sort of look back over your career, over your life, over all the people that have played a role and contributed in that recognition, in that moment. And I think I'm naturally, I'm naturally someone who constantly looks forward. If you were to come into my home, you'll never see any sort of evidence that I'm an athlete or an NBA athlete or a former NBA athlete, other than the size 16 shoes laying around the house. But I never would display any of that for reasons of wanting to continue to pursue forward. And I didn't want to get soft. I didn't want to get satisfied. I didn't want to get comfortable. And so that's always been my mindset as a player, and even in retirement, when I retired at 40. And so, fast forward to that moment, you naturally want to look back and just the totality of your life and your career. And that's when the idea of, let's do this, let's take this on and try to tell my story as best I can.
You mentioned that you retired at 40. And the book, of course, starts off with you being a boy growing up, not even really believing, as you tell the story, that you could imagine that you could be a great basketball player. You talked about all the folks that you looked at and you admired, but did you think you were going to have the kind of longevity that you did and have the kind of impact that you did, both as a player on the collegiate or the professional level?
Yeah, that was certainly part of my struggle and part of my journey early on. There was always that dream, like I think a lot of young people dreaming about sports and fantasizing the idea of playing at the ultimate level. And certainly that was the case early on in football. For a brief period in soccer, I realized I had a better chance of being Dr. J than Pele. And then, eventually in basketball. But I don't know if I truly thought that was a reality. And, as you begin to, separate yourself at an early age, middle school, high school, those years, and start to get recruited and certainly recognized, I kind of struggled with confidence and struggled with doubt. And that wasn't just on the basketball court, but I think in general, and that was, I became really good, I think, at projecting sort of confidence. And I think a lot of that may come from sports where you compete. And regardless of how you feel or what you're feeling, you're able to always project an air of confidence. And you must in order to survive, in order to win. And but I think that also kind of carried over, off the court as well. And so, I think for this, high school age kid who was processing and sort of juggling what was coming with recruitment and the idea of playing in college and maybe the NBA, I was balancing that along with sort of a lack of belief or learning how to, struggling with this idea of confidence. And that kind of coincided, went hand in hand through high school and on through college.
This book, in many ways, is a tribute to your parents, NFL great Calvin Hill and your late mother, Janet Hill. And you talk about both of them in different kinds of ways in terms of the kind of impact that they had on you. Let me start with your father first, who, of course, was a professional athlete. How much pressure did you feel to think about pursuing something other than professional athletics when you were growing up?
That's a great question. I mean, I was always around professional sports and football at a young age. And but there was never this pressure at home to excel in sports. My father was never the little league parent and demanding excellence from me. And, I need to practice or go and, work on this part of my game or what have you. He would certainly get frustrated at times by things I did on the court or on the field. But he never sort of pushed me and I think always, made it fun and allowed me to explore and really, I guess, develop that love and that desire and passion on my own. But, having a father who, there's an intelligence, there's a sophistication, worldly, well-read. I think, the emphasis on education, and then also just the, being engaged, being a part of my life, being, at various, extracurricular activities, piano recitals. I guess we didn't call them play dates back in the 70s and 80s, but just, being there, through it all. I think that was as important than any example as a professional athlete that he provided.
You talk in the book about interning one summer at your mother's firm, and your mother was a partner with the great Clifford Alexander. And you talked about, one, the way having this wider array, this larger network of Black folks really exposed you to all kinds of things. And I was struck about that moment where you write about seeing the Romare Bearden painting. and it really tapping into what then becomes kind of a lifelong interest on your part, to collect art.
Yes, no question. Clifford Alexander, my mother's business partner. I always enjoyed, having the opportunity to sit and pick his brain and just, his career, his life, the tentacles, the connections he had during the civil rights movement, during the White House, in government and business and law. I was always fascinated, and he did. He had. I mean, my parents collected art as well, but oftentimes, particularly during your formative years, it's not cool, that your parents do something. But it's cool sometimes when someone else. And he had this amazing Romare Bearden above his desk in his office, and I always gravitated towards that. But hearing him talk about art and his relationship with Bearden, and how in this particular case Romare Bearden gave him this piece of art, that was incredible. And fast forward many years later, to be able to purchase that piece from the late Mr. Alexander was certainly a highlight. But having access and certainly exposure through my mom and dad and through Clifford Alexander and certainly others, I think eventually led to me wanting to collect at some point. And actually, I think I mentioned this in the book, but the first piece that I acquired was from South Square Mall, or the old South Square Mall in Durham. I had a limited budget, so it was a print, but it was a print by
Ernie Barnes.
Ernie Barnes, and it was the Duke Fast Break that featured Johnny Dawkins from the 1986 Duke basketball team laying the ball up in Cameron against North Carolina. And so that picture was commissioned. I think I paid like $35 for it, and I had it prominently on display in our apartment my junior year.
You spend a lot of time, obviously, in this book talking about Duke, and you talk about the championships, right? And it's funny because when you discuss the road to the Final Four and some of these championships, right, it's matter of fact, right? As it should be, right? We all know what happened. We all watched everything. But you also talk about Duke, I think, in a lot of complicated ways, both in terms of the reputation of the institution and how that's perceived, particularly by Black folks outside of Durham and Black folks outside, not connected to Duke. You talk about how race played out, both at Duke, but also coming to North Carolina as an undergraduate student. And if you could discuss a little bit about what the environment was like, as you discuss in the book, when Jesse Helms and Henry Gantt are running against each other, for governor back in 1992. And you capture kind of an element of Duke that I don't think I've seen since I've been here, in terms of Duke students being engaged as they were in what essentially is a statewide election.
Yeah, no, that was an interesting time. And sort of early on my freshman year, arriving on campus, all of this happening. And, I think for the Black students that were at Duke at that time, we're the offspring of, I guess, the civil rights generation, civil rights movement. And, I think for us, a lot of us, we understood and were aware of the tremendous sacrifices that were made, the opportunities that maybe we had that the previous generation didn't have. And there was really, I think, a sense of, one, a real need to achieve, and a real need to take advantage of this incredible opportunity for an education at Duke. There was also, I think, just this sort of overall spirit of engagement, of connectivity to one another. And so when this was happening leading up to that election in 1990, it was the first time that, for me, I was, sort of engaged and involved, whether it was in conversations, in the dorms, on campus, over meals and social settings, where you felt like you were rolling up your sleeves and you were, getting involved. And I'm not sure how much I was involved in looking back at it, but it certainly at the time, And I also will say, and I know you have studied and taught and certainly written about culture and Black culture, but I think it also coincided with sort of the growth and the energy of the hip hop culture, and I think that was very much prevalent. There was a sense of identity, a sense of pride, and we were of that generation, and so I think the version of hip hop might have been a little bit more diverse back then than what you see now, but there was certainly a sense of awareness, a sense of change, and there was a real energy behind that I think a lot of us as young people reflected.
If you talk to Black students who went to Duke and graduates who attended Duke in the 90s, the early 2000s, folks will talk about the Black bench. and you talk about the Black bench. Yeah, I imagine at this time there could probably be a really great documentary done about the Black bench at Duke University, but talk about the significance of that. And, my sense is, just watching how some of the Black student athletes, interact within the student body now, that Black athletes seem to be more part of a fabric of Black student life, right, at Duke, as well as, generally speaking, in student life at Duke. And it seems as though the Black bench was an important space for Black students to come together at that time.
It was. I think first of all, the reason that it was the Black bench, and I think, in my opinion, the reason it was the Black bench and the reason that particular location was because it was in the shade, and so, but it was, I think, it played an important role, I think, in the experience for me and I would assume other Black students. And as you said, this was 30 plus years ago, and there certainly was pressure to succeed. And you're at a PWI, and so we all, I think, had options. We all chose to come to Duke, and certainly we had options to go elsewhere. But I think sometimes as a Black student, as a Black individual in a predominantly white environment, you can sometimes lose a sense of self. You sometimes can, the idea of feeling inferior can creep in. And so, to have opportunities, whether at the Black bench, at various social gatherings, Black Greek life, wherever on campus, to really spend time to gain strength, to be inspired by one another. I think it played an important role, other than trying to remove ourselves from the sun at different times of the year. But it just helped. I don't know. I felt inspired, and I felt like it helped maintain that sense of identity that I think is very important as a young Black student.
You talk also a lot about how important it was for yourself and for your teammates, Black teammates, to also connect with Black folks in Durham. The number of times you mentioned going up to North Carolina Central and things of that nature. Your own interest in reading often would take you to the No Bookstore. Shout out to Dr. Bruce Bridges. How important was it for Black Durham to see you as being part of that? Y'all are getting your hair cut, right, in Black barbershops, et cetera. How important was that for you?
Yeah, my roommate, Tony Lang, he and I, we ventured off campus quite often. And, I think when I think of my time at Duke, obviously the incredible classes, the faculty, my the student body, the overall sort of spirit that existed on campus was incredible. And I think of those interactions, but also, being out in Durham and in different parts of Durham, and learning about Durham and its history and the role that it played for Black North Carolina, and the opportunities that presented themselves. And so that was an integral part of my experience, and certainly have some deep rooted relationships and connections outside of Duke. And And so, that was, in part, Tony was my roommate from Mobile, Alabama. And I think a lot of times the city of Durham and certain parts of Durham reflected the environment that was familiar to him. And so, so we were able to get out and about. And so I would venture to say that the residents in Durham, and particularly in our community, saw a lot of, I can't speak for everyone, but I know they saw a lot of Tony and I at various places. And certainly some fond memories of those interactions.
So you mentioned one of your white teammates who gets mentioned all throughout the book. And of course, you can't talk about Duke in those eras without talking about Christian Laettner. But Laettner going with you to some of those parties, Laettner teaching you how to play Force MD's Tender Love on the piano, right? This kind of interesting love that he had of Black culture, that really went against the grain of how most of America thought about who he was. And also this idea that you talk about that, until Zion comes along, 30 years later, for you up front, that was an experience of seeing kind of a collegiate athlete have like this immense, incredible attention that you really hadn't seen before. Right. Part of it, of course, is he's there for 4 years, 4 Final Fours, 2 championships, and all those kinds of things. What was it like navigating the world in Christian Laettner's universe? Right. And how was your relationship with him? We all know about what his relationship was like with Bobby Hurley. Right. But what was your relationship with, in terms of someone like Christian Laettner?
Yeah, Christian was and is fascinating. And, full disclosure, I just saw Christian yesterday. We were in Atlanta filming a commercial that'll air during March Madness. So don't tell anybody. But he, and he had read the book and read it multiple times and was very sort of appreciative. One, that I was nice to him. But just, I think, sort of those years, how magical they were. And, Christian, a lot has been written and said in documentaries and so on and so forth, but Christian was an incredible teammate. And I think what gets lost sometimes, and, the I Hate Christian documentary, which, I sat for, and I think Mark Williams, who will be on later, he sat for. They interviewed me for almost 3 hours, and they took 1 or 2 sound bites that sort of supported, their narrative. But right. Christian was competitive. Christian was the ultimate glue guy. He was, much of my time with him was off the court, hanging out with him, going to parties, going to their apartment, watching basketball, talking music, whatever the case may be. And so he really was able to galvanize that team. He pushed us and he would challenge you, but he engaged with you. And to me, that's an incredible sign of leadership, to be able to, someone of his stature, someone who, as I mentioned, was incredibly popular and had a lot of, focus and attention on him, was very much inclusive with all of us. Now, in terms of his fascination with Black culture, Black music, he was at the Black bench quite often, and and he would go to Central. But I remember on my recruiting visit back in the fall of '89, I stayed with Brian and Christian, and I was amazed that. Because a lot of the perceptions I think that people had of him, I had after his freshman year without really knowing him. And I was amazed that he knew all of the hip hop songs. And I'm not talking about the,
no MC Hammer, right?
MC Hammer, but he knew Poor Righteous Teachers and Jungle Brothers and all these. And I had never seen a white guy at that time who was that immersed in hip hop culture. And so, but I absolutely enjoy every minute of playing and working with Christian. And, we don't see each other as often, but those bonds are strong. And it was great to be able to chop it up with him yesterday. So, but he was tough. I mean, he was unique. He was different. And But he was a ball of energy, a ball of fire, and certainly we did some incredible things together.
I think for folks who don't know you well, readers of the book who don't know you well, they were probably surprised by the stories that you told about your junior year at Duke and some of the difficulties you had with your injury and whether or not you wanted to trust Duke doctors, the wearing of the Carolina hat at the party. But for a moment, can you talk about how significant Dr. Frank Bassett was, for you?
Yes, Dr. Bassett, who I did not know or realize at that time was really one of the pioneers in sports medicine. And, he it was an interesting year that year. And I think I showed a lot of times my immaturity in terms of dealing with some setbacks, dealing with injuries, an overall frustration that played out in the book. And I had to be, I was trying to figure out how to best approach. I felt it was important to be authentic, not everything is rainbows and lollipops, as my wife says, and you're going to have those tense moments. And so, to try to be honest about that and talk about my frustration, which was really geared towards Dr. Bassett, Coach K, everybody and anyone at Duke. And then, getting to a point where I realized, like, what am I doing, and why am I reacting this way? It was an important moment for me. But Dr. Bassett, not only did he, operate on me and help me that year, but later on down the road when I was having incredible challenges with my ankle and was, on the verge of retirement, I went back to him and probably should have gone to him initially back in 2000. He and Dr. Nunley at Duke essentially saved my career. And so, I'll forever be indebted to him. He's no longer with us. But, at the time, though, I didn't know who he was and the significance of who he was and the contributions he had made, not just to Duke, but to sports medicine in general.
Let me ask you a hindsight question. Given the difficulties that you narrated from that year, and then, you and Kay having to sit down and kind of talk through what it was going to look like going forward, had it been in an environment like now, where athletes might stay for a year, if they're very good athletes, they're not going to stay longer than 2 years. If you would have had that option at Duke 30 years ago, would you have still stayed for the 4 years or would you have left early?
That is a great question. I think the pressure in today's environment, it would have been really hard to stay 4 years. I'd like to think that I would have. But, so much has changed in intercollegiate athletics and particularly in basketball. And, we've had some incredible players come through Duke in the last decade. And I mean, just, talent, just skill, ability at such a young age to dominate as they have and then go on and have great success in the NBA. But I do feel like you miss out on so much, and obviously you focus on the money, which
Right.
is understandable in the career, but, I wouldn't trade those 4 years, for anything. And I think I realized that even in the moment, even while I was going through it, even, I didn't think much about the NBA. I really didn't think about it until my senior year and like, wow, this is it. This is my last opportunity. But, as an athlete, then also the environment at school, what makes Duke special are the people, and to be around that environment for 4 years. So I feel like a lot of these guys have missed out on that. And I it's hard to feel sorry for Jason Tatum, who's, probably going to have $1 billion or more during his career. But I feel like these guys miss out on what I was able to go through with Tony Lang and Christian Laettner.
Mm-hmm.
And I also feel like we as members of the Duke community, we don't get a chance to really know them. And so it goes both ways a little bit.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about mentors, and specifically talk about your relationship with Tommy Amaker.
You know, back in the early 90s, that school down the road in Chapel Hill, they had a great alum who had a commercial where they, want to be like Mike. And, for all of us, we wanted to be like TA and Tommy Amaker. Tommy is just really one of a kind, just an incredible human being, genuine, smart. He's probably, he recruited me. He played at Duke, was from the Northern Virginia area where I grew up. And, we got to know each other during the recruiting process. But during those 4 years, he was an assistant coach. He was a mentor. He was a big brother. He was a friend and still is to this day. So for him to be there and to help guide, myself and some of the other, other teammates of mine really was important for me. And, Tommy he's just a special, he's a special man. And, but I spent every day before practice, I would go in his office and talk about anything and everything. And so he was my sounding board. He allowed me at times to vent if I had something on my mind, if I was frustrated. So he was also, I guess, a psychiatrist as well during those years. But Tommy was special, and he's gone on and had a fantastic career as a head basketball coach.
When you were writing the book, how much of the process did you share with your wife, Tamia?
I shared none of it. So first of all, the process was interesting because where do you begin? And so I really started, I started at Duke. I started sort of going through the basketball schedule and, looking at that first season and the first game. And so, okay, what comes to mind? What do I remember from that game? And I was pleasantly surprised at how much I was able to recall. And, so that initial sort of crack, like I had too much Duke in the book. And it could have been just a book on the 4 years I had.
Right. Memoir of the time at Duke, yeah.
Yeah, and I thought about that at a moment in time, but, I wanted to tell more, and I also had kind of promised my publisher I would tell more. But, with Tamia, I think, look, this sounds a bit odd, but, I've been sort of, a public figure, I guess, for most, if not all of my adult life. Mm-hmm. But, there's still a part of you that is private. And so we've kind of tried to live our life that way and control what we share with the world, but also cherish what we don't. And so I was very mindful that it was my story and not hers. Yeah. But, she was a part of my story. And so, she was diagnosed with MS back in 2003. And, I didn't want to, there's so much more to that I did not want to unpack. But so what I shared with regards to that was what she has already essentially shared with the public. But yeah, I was very mindful that this is my story, not hers. Yeah. And so not until I was done and, sort of, kind of a rough final draft, if you will, did I share with her. And instantly she went to read about, once we met and, what did I say about her and about us and all of that. And so, and eventually she got around to reading the entire book. But during the process, no, I think she gave me space and allowed me to go through that myself.
How about your children? Have they read the book and do they really appreciate who their dad is in that regard in terms of what Grant Hill means to a particular community, in this case, Duke, but other communities?
That's a good question. I think they've read it. I haven't wisdom on it. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think they are aware of sort of who I am and certainly my wife and what we mean to Duke. And certainly we've attempted to brainwash them since birth. So they've been to campus and are very familiar with Duke and the like. But yeah, I mean, I think as they've gotten older, there's a greater sense of that. And, for a while, particularly, at the end of my career where I was, a shell of myself and more of a role player, complimentary player, my oldest daughter, she used to call me a scrub and, why do people want your autograph? You average 10 points a game, and so, she would show no love. And, then every once in a while she might go on YouTube. This was, back in 2009, 2010. And she would say, Dad, you had a commercial? And, I think as they've gotten older, there's a greater sense and understanding of sort of the life I had before they were born, but also just the relationship and the significance, I think, of my role at Duke and certainly what we were able to accomplish many years ago.
I got a couple more questions before we open this up to the audience. One of the chuckles that I got reading the book was you describing winning that first championship, and then Biv Devoe were coming through, right? And they wanted to play some ball with y'all first, right? But then y'all got your shout out, to come on stage, and of course Rick Fox is sitting there, right, salty, right, because he didn't get a ring that year.
Yeah, that might have been like the highlight of my freshman year. That day. So we won on a Monday against Kansas. Of course, we came back and there was a great reception in Cameron and just the excitement, I think, throughout campus for that whole week. And then we ended up going to UVA for a friend of mine's was in a fraternity, and we all went up there, and then we drove back, and we had BBD and Keith, and Johnny, BBD,
Johnny Gill, Keith Sweat,
and Johnny Gill. Anyway, we played them at Chapel Hill High School that Sunday, the day of their concert, and the bet was if we beat you guys, you're going to bring us up on stage, and so of course we beat them. And so we were there, we go backstage, and then they bring me, Tony Lang, Christian Laettner, and Brian Davis on stage. And we're dancing with their dancers on stage in the Dean Dome. And Rick Fox was there, and he's looking at me, and he's just like, and to me, it was like the ultimate sign of disrespect to be in their building on their stage, just won the championship. And so, if my basketball career ended then, it wouldn't have been any better.
You talk about the perception in the book of Duke being this kind of upper middle class preppy school. And I always go back to that picture of Tupac wearing Jeff Capel's jersey. Mm-hmm. And a lot of folks will think that was Photoshop, but no, that was Tupac. Did you actually feel yourself, right? Because there's always been this sense, you mentioned CBS came and they did a hit job on Black students segregating themselves at Duke, right? There was always this kind of perception about Duke students. When Jalen does his documentary in 2011, right, it's still that kind of narrative. Did you actually feel that kind of hate towards Duke, right, when you were a Duke student and kind of traveling around the country, or was it really just more so of almost like a media-made facade?
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, I understand, I think now, sort of how people perceived us back then. I grew up a huge Lakers fan, and I despised the Boston Celtics. And part of why I didn't like the Celtics was, they were the big rival of the Lakers, but also because they had, Larry Bird, who was cold. And I mean, no doubt he could play, but, Larry Bird, Danny Ainge, Kevin McHale. And so the whole idea of, the Lakers as this sort of, predominantly black team, and then the Celtics,
Right.
and then also some of the racial history that I was aware of, in Boston, growing up in the 80s. And so that played a role in sort of how I felt. But, as it related to Duke, I feel like we were somewhat insulated from all of that. It was a different time. Obviously, you didn't have technology, social media, all those things. And quite frankly, when you came to Cameron, we booed you. And when we went elsewhere, they booed us. And so I think in part, I just, I thought that was what competitive college sports was all about. I understood what Duke was, and it's an elite private school, but I also understood what Georgetown was. And Georgetown was very similar. It just so happened you had a strong black male figure as a head coach and an all black team. And so I think while we were in the midst of it all, I looked at, our experience as black student athletes no different than, Randolph Childress and Rodney Rogers down the street at Wake Forest, and then Brian Weiss at Carolina, and, James Forrest and Travis Best at Georgia Tech. I mean, all great schools, some private or most private, some public, but we're at PWIs and we're student athletes. And so I don't know. I feel like that's, I was probably a little bit naive, but I don't know if I was fully aware of this angst and this narrative that was sort of being created. Maybe in part because we beat an all-black UNLV team, and then the next year we beat an all-black Fab Five team. But at the time, I must confess I didn't read the newspaper other than the Chronicle, so I wasn't aware of all of these stories and maybe some of the media hype that was played a role in maybe some of that narrative being created.
Absolutely. I'm going to call our friend Harry Jones into the mix now to help moderate the Q&A session. How you doing today, Harry?
Hey, what's going on, Mark? Hey, what's going on, Grant? Thank you guys so much for what has already been a very insightful conversation. Thank you to the over 1,000 Dukies and Duke friends tonight that have tuned in. We're all very grateful for that. A lot of great questions from the audience. So I'm going to get right to it. Grant, you're now on Duke's board of trustees. So obviously in that role, you have the ability to shape the university. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience has meant to you thus far? And obviously as Duke, we're upcoming on our centennial. How would you like Duke to continue to lead in various conversations?
Yeah, no, it's an incredible honor and privilege to serve on the board of trustees. And I'll tell you what, I think, as I'm sort of in the midst of my second year as a trustee, I think I was, certainly surprised at, what the overall enterprise that Duke is, and the Duke University hospital system, and just how complex, and also, some of the interesting opportunities and challenges that are out there in higher ed overall, but also how that plays into it with Duke. And so, but it's I'm still sort of learning what a trustee is and what our responsibility is. But I'm fascinated as I'm sort of re-engaging with the university, how much the university has changed and evolved, and how much better the school and the experience is. We have greater faculty, we have greater options, we have facilities, we have the best and brightest students. I mean, it's incredible as I'm learning about the school. It's a very different university than it was 30 years ago, as it should be. And so, as we, project ahead, and, some of the headwinds that exist in society, some of the headwinds that exist overall in higher education, how do we navigate that? How do we continue to continue to evolve, continue to reach, to achieve and pursue, greatness like we've done. And so those kind of discussions whether it's related to the health, the hospital system, whether it's undergraduate education, or graduate schools. Right now, something that is happening with the school is on West Campus, and sort of reimagining sort of the campus experience and what that's like. And so you have to constantly sort of adapt and adjust with the times, but also look ahead to the future. And so I'm excited about that. I'm invigorated when I come to a trustee meeting, and I'm excited. It's like it's a homecoming, but it's also stimulating, engaging, just fascinating. All that encompasses who we are as a university. And so, yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm still onboarding in a virtual environment last year was certainly challenging, but now as we begin to have, we've had meetings this year in person, you're beginning to understand what the responsibility is, and certainly finding your voice, as we provide oversight to the university.
Thank you so much for that. I think it provides a great segue to my next question. And I have to certainly give a shout out as well for all of us and DBA. Your mom meant so much to us, me personally as a mentor, to Mark, to Sanders. DBA, Duke Black alumni, would not have been where we are without her continued support. Can you give us one of your favorite memories of Janet from within the Duke space and one outside of Duke?
Yeah, it was interesting. My mom was on the board of trustees for 15 years. And, it was, often, like, first of all, for a number of years, because of her role as a trustee, I'm learning about what's happening at Duke, through her. And oftentimes I'd have to remind her, like, Mom, you didn't go to Duke. And, but, she absolutely positively fell in love with the school. And I think the relationship for her started as a parent and certainly evolved as a trustee. And so, she was, it was just, I'd call her to find out about what was happening at my alma mater. And so that was quite fascinating and interesting. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, and I don't know if I mentioned this in the book with my mom, but whatever she did, whenever she jumped in 100%. And, so in terms of her role as a trustee, in terms of, DBA, and providing hopefully some counsel and guidance as DBA was evolving a few years ago. But I go back every stage of my life, from grade school to middle school, high school. She was always the PTA president. And then when I arrived at Duke, she was the co-chair of the parents committee. And so, I joke, I used to joke when I'd say this, but I could never escape her. She was always there. And I was proud of that, but she was incredible. And the ability to dive into the details, to process information. I always feel like her mathematician background, ability to problem solve. She was a valuable resource to Duke, but also a valuable resource to many individuals who have connections to Duke. And so I told the Duke Board of Trustees during orientation, as I rolled on the board, as she rolled off, I said, look, I'm the daughter of Janet Hill, but I am not Janet Hill. They broke the mold when they made Janet Hill. So I just wanted to, lower the level of expectation just a little bit as I was rolling onto the board.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. She actually attended just about every, webinar and live event that we've had. So, her support was unwavering at all steps of our growth, for sure. Want to talk a little bit about your aspirations for USA basketball. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's a great opportunity, great challenge. The the international game, and we've had tremendous success. Really, starting Coach K was played a big role providing the leadership and helping to not just revamp the system of USA basketball, but also reclaim our dominance at a time back in the early 2000s when the rest of the world was catching up. And I think what people don't fully understand or appreciate about the international game, it is more their game than it is our game. It's the style is different, the rules are different, how it's officiated is different. And, for a lot of foreign teams, this is how they've played their whole life. And so it's a real adjustment period. And the challenge is you have essentially a couple of weeks to bring these incredible individuals together and become one and sort of, build that team and understanding roles and responsibilities, and then also the game itself. And so, with the success that Coach K had with the Redeem team in 2008 and 2012, a lot of those games, particularly the medal games, were very close. And so there's a great respect for the international game. And, we have a chance now to usher in a new generation and bring young players and young coaches into the pipeline and get them excited about being a part of USA basketball, representing your country and playing on the ultimate stage in the World Cup and in the Olympics. And we have the 2023 World Cup next summer in the Philippines, and then the following year is the Olympics in Paris. And one interesting sort of tidbit is that, for American-born players, the World Cup is not the end-all be-all. It's the Olympics. They want to play in the Olympics. That's not the tough sell. The tough sell is getting our players to want to be a part of the World Cup, where conversely, a number of international players, the World Cup is just as important, if not more important, than the Olympics. And so I'm not as worried about or concerned about the Olympics. We'll get the best players and the best talent, and it's in Paris. And so guys and their families will want to be there. But we'll have some challenge, and it'll be a bit of a challenge, and we have our work cut out for us with the upcoming summer. But I've enjoyed it. It's incredible. There's been great receptivity. Folks have been receptive to it, and I have a great coaching staff led by Steve Kerr. And it's a chance to roll up your sleeves and hopefully when it's all said and done, we can come home with the gold this upcoming summer.
Thank you so much for that. We're looking forward to that as well. Obviously, you've had so many robust experiences in different spaces in basketball. What are some of the direct lessons that you took from basketball and that you've applied to the business world?
Great question. I've always felt that sports is a microcosm of life, and there's so many values that you take from being an athlete. And I had a great education in Cameron, learning from an incredible leader in Coach K. And, I just think discipline, hard work, collective responsibility, these were themes that he, as a coach, emphasized on a daily basis, working with others and managing failure and success. And, and the great thing about sports is that you're doing it on a public stage. Oftentimes in business, you get results over time. But now in sports, the results are instant, they're immediate. And so how you're able to manage that and the good and the bad, the highs and the lows, but the ability to work with others, to empower others, to inspire others is so important. And so I find myself often, as I'm involved in the business world, sort of falling back on these principles and things that I learned from my own experiences as an athlete. And oftentimes even as a parent, and certainly trying to convey certain messages to my children. They're like, Dad, we're tired of hearing about, what it's like to join a locker room and you're the new guy. And, but a lot of those stories, I feel like they're so similar and they're real and they're, and so to have done it on the highest level was an incredible foundation for me as I transitioned out of playing. And I've applied them. I've used them on the boards that I serve on in corporate America. I've used them in the various leadership roles in sport. And then in my own, business and having employees, it's people, it's managing people, it's inspiring people, it's connecting with people. And that's what leadership is about. That's what it's hiring and identifying quality people and then giving them the opportunity and all the resources to be successful. And so anyway, I didn't have the career path that many had in the business world, but my foundation was really through sports, and I'm grateful for that. I think that was for me a fantastic foundation to have.
Absolutely, thank you for that. I know this next question is going to be like choosing between your children. What's your favorite basketball game at Duke and then in the NBA?
Oh wow, it's hard to remember the NBA because there's so many games. I mean, 82 games. And I think that's in part why I had a hard time remembering certain things in the NBA, particularly my years in Detroit. It was all sort of at times a big blur and really challenging trying to go back and recall. But I vividly remembered games, moments, conversations, during my 4 years in college. So, I think my favorite memory, favorite game at Duke probably was the Vegas game in '91. And, aside from, a horrible haircut that I had for that Final Four, which I kind of went through in the book. I didn't go into, I mean, like Tony and I, we almost got in a fight, like when I got back to the dorm. And because I blamed him for allowing my barber to essentially, give me a horrible haircut. And so that was a real funny moment. But, I think for Coach K, and it's hard, I think, for younger folk to realize this, but at that time, he had gotten so close, but was unable to win the big one. And had been to the championship game in '86, had been to the Final Four in '88, Final Four '89, and then was embarrassed in '90 in the final game against UNLV. And then for us to go through this almost unexpected year we had my freshman year, and to improve and to get better, and then ultimately to face them again. Once we beat them, that not only propelled us to win 2 nights later against Kansas, but I think it just gave us this confidence and this belief that we had arrived as a program. And that carried over into the next year. And I feel like we kind of, we planted our flag that Duke basketball was real. And we're iconic, we're blue blood, we're all those things. And I feel like, maybe I'm biased because I was there and I was a part of that team, but I feel like that was when there was a shift that occurred, when Duke basketball became what Duke basketball has been for the last 30 years.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Want to be mindful of everyone's time this evening. Thank you to the audience for all of those amazing questions. Thank you again, Grant and Mark. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mark Williams, class of '92, for some closing remarks. Thank you all.
Wow. Grant, Professor Neal, Harry, thank you all. What a fantastic conversation this is. It's almost hard for me to find words to follow that. But when we're talking about someone like Grant, I have to admit it makes it a little bit easier. My relationship with Grant, it goes back a long time, more than 30 years. And as you could probably tell from Kareem's conversation, introduction at the beginning, Grant is as good and as true a friend as anyone really could ask for. And he's one of the best people that I know. I remember the beginning pretty vividly. We talked about Tommy Amaker, but I was sitting in the stands at Georgetown University watching a summer league game with a couple of fellow Dukies, Tommy Amaker and Brian Davis, and Grant was out there playing. He was a rising senior in high school. and he was out there competing with the collegiate kids and really holding his own. And I think even then, we knew he would be good, but it was impossible to sort of appreciate how special he would be both as a player and as a person. I remember his recruiting trip to Duke that he talked about, that and so many other events and milestones that we read about in the book. And I give you all that really just for context, because to see how Grant has evolved and grown from this, gangly but really talented high school kid into a collegiate champion a couple times over, NBA player, all-star, Hall of Famer. He is a father and husband, which he's most proud of, and a businessman. You heard Kareem talk through all the different things that he's done, even a part owner of an NBA franchise. For me, that is all just so heartwarming as kind of the old head in the crew. But if you were to ask Kareem or Sanders or Ann or anybody who knows him well, they would all tell you the same. Reading game and listening to this conversation again, it just, brought back so many memories for me that frankly I'd forgotten about. And, to this day, every time we get together, we sit there, we talk about and reminisce about how special our experience was at Duke. How we were kind of young and dumb, and there was this perfect blend of innocence, and in the case of people like Grant, greatness. And as he said, it was a time when, staying in school for 4 years was not the exception, it was the norm. And it enables you to have those types of experiences. The book also, gave us real insight into so many things in Grant's life and about his journey that we've seen him kind of keep tucked away and really hidden or shielded from public view for so long. So speaking for everyone on this call, Grant, my brother, we thank you for that. It's been mentioned, but I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention Calvin and Janet, who have been so influential in my life. Janet, the general, she touched, as you heard, so many in the Duke community and far, far beyond. I think, Mrs. Hill, and she'll always be Mrs. Hill to me, no matter how many times she said, call me Janet. But she really, really would have loved this conversation today. I'm sure there's some of us on the line who can't help but think back. I'm calling out Sterling, whose name's up at the top of the screen here, but think back to that time when Mrs. Hill and Grant shared a very similar stage, how special that night was. So we miss her terribly. Professor Neal and Grant, I thought you all did a wonderful job bringing Grant's story to life and then making this conversation something that was interesting to this community and insightful for this community. I'll kind of leave you with this, and I do say this from the heart. We've come together this evening as a community in a way that, to me, feels uniquely Duke, to celebrate one of our own. And I think many of us on this Zoom, we either know Grant or we've had the chance to meet him or interact with him over the years, because, let's just face it, through it all, and that's all the successes, all the accolades, he's continued to make himself that accessible. And I think that's something he learned from both of his parents, and it's incredibly rare, and we appreciate that. I think we think of him as a friend or a brother or simply a Duke treasure, which he is. But the more I read the book and reminded myself of the stories, it became clear to me that, Grant's a little bit more than that. I think he's a national treasure. And on top of all that, we're all just proud that he's a Dookie. So he's going to give me grief after this for the national treasure bit, but I believe it. And I don't think there's anything in this world he can't do. So thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to turn this over to Sanders and Ann for final remarks.
Thanks, Mark. First of all, it is amazing, Grant, to be here as a member of class of 1994. There's several of us, Sanders, Kareem, Mark, we'll consider you an honorary class of 1994. But nonetheless, I think it's no secret that we came to Duke at a time that was just really unlike any other. And Grant, a big piece of that was you and what you brought, not only in the basketball program, but for those of us who have had the honor to get to know you. As Mark said, it is, whether it's us knowing your generosity, us knowing your caring nature, honestly, for those who are around you, and for those of us that get to know your humor. You shared a little bit of a glimpse of it tonight, but I think that for anybody who spends any time with you, you can't help but be laughing by, within 5 minutes of being there. And, I think back to the moments where we trekked. I mean, this was a trek into Raleigh. It was not a BBD moment, to be clear, but we went to the zoo. And you'll probably remember this, where we were in our pursuit to get an A in, the history of African American dance. Yes, you remember this. And we were out there trying to, there's probably footage of this somewhere. Hopefully somebody threw it away, but I'm sure it exists. But, whether it's that or me, the girl from Detroit, when you joined the Pistons and you saw me up, in the seats, and you invited me down courtside because you saw my Duke sweatshirt and you saw me. That's the feeling of always being a part of your family and being a friend to you. And, I just want to say that, we are so proud of you, all that you represent as a Duke alum. You represent the best of us. You are the best of us. And we're always cheering you on, no matter what the next thing that you take on is. And I am ever impressed at the next things that you take on. So today we talked about, USA basketball, but you and I have talked about being on boards of directors. And so I'm just cheering you on because you know what, as a Dookie, we show no signs of slowing down, and you're no different. So we're looking for you to continue to make the impact, but more importantly, want you to know that we just really thank you for sharing a piece of yourself in game, sharing it with the world, many who are endeared to you because of knowing your success. But for those of us who know you personally, it really was an opportunity for us to have everyone else know the side of Grant or pieces of Grant that we know. So thank you for being you, and thank you for being here tonight and sharing with so many of us on this call.
Well, thank you, Ann. I will bring us home. I am Sam Zadu, a former co-chair for Duke Black Alumni and also a former board member for Duke Alumni Association. I really wanted to thank, of course, Grant, my classmate from '94, Kareem, also class '94, and Ann, Mark, and Professor Neal. Sterling, I think you've got to run for your money in terms of the best class at Duke. I know she likes to say class of '83 is the best, but I think '94 is going to give you a run for your money. Before we close, I just want to encourage everyone to please update your profile on the Duke Alumni Network. That is a way that we keep in touch with folks and keep you up to date on what's happening at Duke. So please do update your profile. Before we close, I would like to just take a quick moment of silence. We lost two of our beloved Duke Black Alumni members over the last 10 days or so. Pam Stanback, Lean, class of '77, and my classmate, Kwanzaa Ronnie Butler, class of '93. So I want to just have a quick moment of silence for both of them, and then we will close out. Thank you all. Thanks, Grant. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone. Forever Duke. Take care.